A grisly murder, confusing graffiti, and a toss-up between German spy games or occult practices. I'm Matt, and this is the Spectred Isle. Welcome to the Spectred Isle, a channel dedicated to the myths, mysteries and malcontents that inhabit these great isles of Britain. Moving a little bit away from pure paranormal, this marks the first in my series of mysteries. This series will cover all sorts of events, people and places of interest that remain unsolved, unexplained or just plain weird. Today we're looking at the mystery of who put Bella in the Wych Elm, a murder mystery in the Midlands town during the height of World War II that remains unsolved to this day. It was April 18th, 1943, when 4 teenage boys from the town of Hagley were exploring the woodland nearby, appropriately named Hagley Woods. As their story goes, they were out hunting for birds' nests to appropriate their eggs. Not unusual, given eggs had been added to the list of rationed food 3 years earlier, and hunger was a real problem for the beleaguered people of Britain. Spotting the gnarled remains of an old elm tree, specifically a wych elm, also known as a Scots elm, Bob Farmer clambered up to have a peek for nests, and saw what he thought was an animal skull stuffed into the cavity of the trunk below him. He picked the skull up, thinking he could scare his friends with it, when he discovered a small patch of rotting flesh on the forehead, with lank hair attached to it. The 2 front teeth were crooked. The boys panicked and fled for home, though not without first making a pact that they will keep silent. Trespassing on a viscount's land was bad enough, but finding a dead body was more trouble than they thought it worth. However, the youngest, Tom Willett, was racked with worry and told his father, who reported the finding to the Worcestershire police, and they attended the scene the following day. Police found not just a skull inside the tree, but full skeletal remains, and concluded the tightness of the hollow trunk meant she must have been placed in there before or immediately after her death, as rigor mortis would have otherwise made it very difficult. She was missing some teeth, but more bizarrely she was missing her right hand, the bones of which were later found several paces away as though taken as a prize before being tossed aside. She had a few scraps of clothing and shoes, as well as what appeared to be a gold-banded wedding ring. A piece of taffeta cloth was also found down her throat, the assumption being that she had died from asphyxiation and that this had occurred around 18 months ago. Local pathologist Professor James Webster studied the body and concluded she was around 35 to 40 years old, 5 feet tall, had some dental issues including a recent extraction, and had given birth at least once. So who was the victim they found in the tree? The truth is, to this day, nobody can be sure for certain. There are plenty of theories going around, which we will of course go into shortly, but nothing has been conclusively proven. Using the items they found and the forensic analysis, police had a reasonably good idea as to what she looked like and tried to match her description against the missing persons database. Unfortunately, this was at the height of the Blitz, when German bombers were on a routine, sometimes nightly basis, flying over Britain for bombing raids. There were a lot of missing people, many presumed buried under the as yet uncleared rubble in the hardest hit areas, although with government mandated blackouts in force to hide populated areas from German eyes, it was the perfect time to get away with things under the cover of darkness. I can't imagine Bella was the only person to meet such an unfortunate end during that period of history. The police also tried local dentists, presuming that because of Bella's distinctive dental situation, there shouldn't be too many matches among dental records and they could narrow her identity down quite easily. Sadly, this did not pan out either. Even the name given to her, Bella, was posthumous. Perhaps the most mystifying element of this case is that the following year, graffiti seemed to pop up out of nowhere in several parts of the surrounding area. The first, sprayed on a wall in Old Hill about 6 miles from Hagley, read, "Who put Lou Bella down the Wych Elm?" And not long after, in central Birmingham, about 12 miles from Hagley, a similar message: who put Bella down the Wych Elm, Hagley Wood? At no point prior to these pieces of graffiti had the name of the woman been given. Police didn't even know what her name was, which meant that either the graffiti artist was making an assumption about the woman's identity, or they knew who she was. Fast forward to the 21st century, and attempts have been made to try and establish who she was by the power of modern DNA testing. The BBC even requested access to her remains to conduct this study, only to throw up another mystery. The remains, as well as all the pathology records, have vanished. Let's start with the more obvious theory first, and yet the one that actually has the least evidence to go off. In 1944, the police were informed by a sex worker in Birmingham that another sex worker called Bella or Lou Bella had gone missing around 3 years earlier and allegedly worked on the Hagley Road. The 3 years ago takes us back to 1941, which is when this woman was determined to have died according to Professor Webster. He claims that she died in October, so while I can't find any exact date for when this report was made to the police, one would assume that it was late 1944 if the wording was 3 years ago instead of 2.5 to 3 years ago. I pointed this out because the graffiti mentioning Bella's name was first reported in March 1944 and had appeared in the local newspaper, so you could deduce that the missing persons report was filed after this name became known. Maybe there was a missing sex worker called Bella, and after hearing about this murder being linked to that name not far from where she went missing, the friend of hers reported it to the police. That would make sense given why else would they wait 3 years before making the report. The problem is it's not uncommon for people to be reactionary when giving statements on criminal investigations, and we often see people come forward with what they think is evidence but actually isn't. Like if an identity sketch is released to the public and someone thinks, that sort of looks like my next door neighbour, even though they had never suspected their next door neighbour of any kind of foul play before that. Some theories I've read link this disappearance to a meteor theory, which I'll discuss in a moment, that posits that this sex worker was of Dutch origin. But from the sources I've read, I can't seem to find any evidence that the reported missing woman was Dutch at all, and it seems like people have just naturally put the two theories together due to the almost complete lack of information about this supposed Lou Bella. As unfortunate as it may be to mystery lovers if this turns out to be the correct theory, what is more unfortunate is that we can add this to an already long list of violent acts committed towards women who work in the sex industry. And given the length of that list, it's sadly very possible that this is what happened. A more prevalent theory comes in the form of Anna of Claverley, otherwise known as Una Mossop. In early 1953, a newspaper columnist, Lieutenant Colonel Wilfred Byford Jones, under the pen name K-Store, wrote several articles about the murder and attributed it to the occult and witchcraft, which we will get to. On November 18, 1953, a woman referring to herself as Anna of Claverley wrote to K-Store to debunk his theories and claimed to know of a source who could give the actual true details of the event. This Anna turned out to be Una Mossop, a local woman who had been married to a man named Jack Mossop. Jack was an engineer and a bit of a drinker, and in Una's statement to the police, he came home one night, drunk as a skunk, having been in the company of a Dutchman known as Van Ralt. Apparently they had been out at a local pub, and a woman referred to solely as the Dutch Piece was with them, who joined them in Van Ralt's car. The woman passed out during the journey, and in order to teach her some kind of lesson about getting too drunk, Van Ralt suggested they put her in a tree in Hagley Wood, because obviously that's what you do. According to Una, she left Jack not long after, seemingly due to exhaustion of his drunken behaviour rather than because of this specific incident. She says she saw him 3 more times after that in a bid to retrieve her possessions from him, and on the last occasion he said he was being haunted by the image of a woman leering at him from a tree. The following year, he had admitted himself into a mental institution and died not long after. While this seemed like a likely solution to the mystery, there were some glaring errors. For one, if all they did was put Bella in the tree to sleep her drink off and teach her a lesson, what about the cloth found lodged down her throat? One source I found said the boys who found her skull claimed they wrapped some cloth around a stick in order to nudge the skull back into the tree. But a lot of sources seem to agree that the cloth was the same as the lining of the skirt Bella wore. Secondly, and much more importantly, what was Bella's hand doing completely amputated and lying on the ground several paces away? Another mystery is who was Van Ralt. The police looked into this, even contacting the Dutch embassy, but no evidence ever came about as to who this fellow was or if he even existed. According to Una, she had suspicions that this man may have been a Dutch spy, as he seemingly had no work but always plenty of money. Which leads us on to our next theory. Byford Jones, under his pseudonym K-Store, accompanied the Worcestershire police when they went to meet Anna of Claverley following her mysterious letter. Not just a columnist, he was also an author, and known for being a gifted storyteller with a penchant for embellishment. A story he penned about the meeting for a newspaper was much more elaborate than the statement Una actually gave to police. In his version, she outright confirmed her suspicions that Van Ralt was a spy for Germany, and that her ex-husband was part of a pro-German conspiracy. It also claims this Bella lady was also part of the spy network, having arrived in Britain earlier that year and had been killed either because she knew too much or had fallen out with the group. It's worth noting that this story heavily contradicts the statement that Una gave to the police. It falsely, as far as we know, claims MI5 were brought into the investigation, and at one point it even involves a trapeze artist for some reason, so we take the Lieutenant Colonel's story with a Hulk-sized pinch of salt. That being said, this isn't the only story linked to German spies. Joseph Jacobs, famously known as the last person to be executed in the Tower of London, as far as we know, was a German spy who was caught by farmers after he broke his ankle when parachuting into Cambridgeshire. One of his possessions was a photograph of the German singer and actress Clara Bowell, who he claimed was not only his lover, but also a spy who had parachuted somewhere into the West Midlands. This theory doesn't really explain why she would have been killed and hidden in a tree, outside of some references to the Dutch piece being called Clara Bell, and that sounds slightly like Clara Bowell, but the theory took off a little more due to Clara's sudden disappearance from appearing in films or recordings, and sort of matching up to Bella's estimated date of death. This theory has, however, been totally debunked by the finding of the singer and actress's death certificate, putting her death in Berlin in December 1942, a full year after Bella's and 1,300 kilometres away from the tree. That death record was uncovered by the blog site josephjacobs.info, which I'll link in the description below because that was a massive support in making this video. They seem to have clearly done more investigation into this case than even the police did. Not only do they have their own in-depth articles on theories, possible victims and murderers, but they review seemingly every piece of media about the case and even paid an extensive sum to gain access to the original Worcestershire police files. They are well worth checking out if you want to read into this case in much more depth than I've afforded here. One thing that has prompted a re-engagement of the interest in the spy idea is the changing graffiti. So since the 1970s, the phrase "who put Bella in the wych elm" or similar has cropped up around Birmingham, most famously on an obelisk in Hagley not far from where Bella was found. This graffiti in particular has been, for the most part, left alone, seen as part of the local culture and history, and even cordoned off by the local government. However, in 2020, the word "who" in that phrase was sprayed over with the word "hers," as some believe this to be a misspelling of hairs, plural of the German word Herr as a title for a man, in the same way that we use Mr. in English. The implication being that Herrs, Misters, refers to two or more German men responsible for her death, lending credence to the spy ring theory. And some even use this to explain why, at some point over the last 80 years, her remains and all of the pathology records have mysteriously vanished. Now this is the theory you've been waiting for, let's be real. The history of this channel shows that I am not a true crime kind of guy. My interest lies in the weird, the inexplicable, and the downright spooky. This theory was first put forward by Margaret Murray. Previously an Egyptologist that was overlooked in favour of her male colleagues, she eventually became a folklorist and is seen as the grandmother of the modern Wicca movement thanks to her books on witchcraft. Her theory was that Bella's death was in some way related to a local coven of witches, in particular as the removal of a hand does play part in ritualistic murder. Specifically, a hand must be removed to create a Hand of Glory, an artifact that, when used as a candle holder and the candle lit, could put people into some kind of trance or coma, commonly attributed to thieves who could steal without being caught or disturbed. The sticking point to this is that the description of creating a Hand of Glory required it to be removed from the hand of a criminal as they hung from a gibbet. Perhaps Bella had somehow wronged the local coven, or she was a German spy and that justified the criminality, but there's no evidence to suggest that she was hung, either from a gibbet or a noose of any kind, which could be why the hand was discarded. One of the witches could have rechecked the literature after cutting off her hand and realised they did the ritual wrong, and so the hand was left there, now useless to their goals. As for the choice of tree, perhaps this was just because it was a hollow tree in a secluded place, but elms do crop up in some notable mythological literature. In Greek mythology, elm was one of the 8 forest nymphs and was the first tree Artemis used her silver bow to practice on. They also crop up several times in the Iliad, all with some element of mythological significance, including being planted on a couple of heroes' tombs. Roman mythology also references elm trees, notable the Stygian elm in the Aeneid, and Virgil comments on them being seen as bad omens due to their useless fruits. In Northern Europe, Embla, the first woman in the world, was born from an elm, and similarly in Japan the chief goddess of the Ainu, Kamufuchi, also was. Naturally, the appearance of elms in these mythologies seems to waver between being good or evil depending on the source, so who knows the significance they may have played in this ritualistic killing, but there is a mythological relevance either way. Now, as much as I enjoy these weird and wonderful tales, and no matter how many times I jokingly point out that cryptids and ghosts and the like are totally real, we have to put on an air of skepticism discussing these sorts of theories in case the normies accuse us of being crazy. But I will point out that even though the occult ritual theory is the least normal explanation for the death, it is the only one that adequately explains why Bella's hand was removed only to be thrown aside afterwards. Bear in mind, from all the information I've read, the hand was described as being amputated. I can't see any theories that it was potentially pulled out by a bird or a cat or a fox or whatever who then dropped it again. Some reports claim that rather than her entire hand being found several places away, what was actually discovered were finger bones scattered around the trunk. With so many of the police records missing, I guess we'll never know the exact truth. But that still doesn't explain how the fingers were removed in the first place, and I don't think a piece of taffeta cloth will do the trick. Add on to that, a few years later, on Valentine's Day 1945, a man by the name of Charles Walton was murdered in a ritualistic fashion, also in the Midlands, about 40 miles from Hagley. When I say he was murdered in a ritualistic fashion, he had a pitchfork driven over his neck to keep his head in place, he was manoeuvred in an odd way, and then his neck was slashed with a hook which was left there. It looked ritualistic in the way that he had seemingly been pinned in place for the murder to happen in that particular way, but the supernatural elements of it that are reported, from claims of inscriptions carved onto him through to sightings of black dogs, blame being pointed at a local witch, and claims it was done close to a druid circle, all seem to have come much later down the line and are probably embellishments. However, that was enough to give police a line of inquiry into occult causes of Bella's death, but as expected, their investigation into that side of things went nowhere. And that's where we end up to this day. No concrete evidence either way as to who did it or who she was, though the mysterious disappearance of the evidence we did have will raise eyebrows amongst the cover-up community. Naturally, it's up to you whether you choose to believe this was a ritual carried out by a secret witch coven, or the far more terrifying idea that it was simply another unnecessary murder of another sex worker. I won't do my usual close today, as daydreaming about magic would be a little disrespectful to Bella's memory, whoever she may have been. But as always, stay safe, stay sane, and have a good one.